Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm excited to share an extra video with you this week. We've been having such gorgeous sunshiny days over the past week or so in Yorkshire, and the weather has inspired me to think about my summer reading, and I thought I would share some of my suggestions for great books to read in the summer with you all, in case you want to plan your summer reads a bit further ahead as well. So I've got a lot of books here. I've loosely categorized them into some classic books, some sort of just general summer reads, YA and children's books, and then also I'll finish up with some suggested summer books to have on your bedside table. So maybe get a cup of tea or a glass of rosé, why not? And I hope you enjoy this bookish extra video from me this week. So to start off with some classic books, I read Jane Austen all year round, but for some reason I always find myself returning to Emma, especially in the summer. Now, Emma is May's comfort book club choice, and I would also remind those of you who are reading along with us this month to please send in your voice message by next Wednesday, the 25th of May, and we'll be discussing the book on the 27th of May. But this is a book that I think is the perfect start to summer. I love the strawberry picking scene in Emma, and the picnic on Box Hill as well. I think it's those two scenes that are such standout scenes for me. And of course, strawberry picking and having a picnic excursion out in the British countryside, both those things are such great summer activities. So that's the reason why I return to Emma so much in the summer months. Of course, there are some great Christmas scenes too, and scenes from all through the year, but it's those summer ones that really stand out for me. So it really is a pleasure to return to Emma for the summertime. And I love the audiobook of this as well. I'll link my favourite. I think it's read by Jenny Agata, but I'll double check the narrator and I'll link my favourite in the description box down below in case you're interested in the audio as well. Now, talking about strawberry picking, famous scenes from literature, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, of course, has a famous scene involving strawberries in it as well. And there are such beautiful descriptions of summertime in the English countryside in this book that I love to return to this one in the summer too. It's one of my favourite Hardy books, and I really recommend reading it in the summertime. I reread it, I think a couple of summers back when I first moved to Yorkshire, and it really opened up my eyes to some of the delights of the countryside in those months, and it was just a very special summer when we moved, and I was reading a lot of seasonal books at that time, and I always remember that summer and the books that I read my very first summer in Yorkshire. And this was one that I reread. I hadn't read Tess for years, and I so enjoyed returning to it, and I really recommend, if you've never read it, then do, or even if you read it years ago and maybe thought you didn't enjoy it, I really would recommend returning to it, because I thoroughly enjoyed rereading this. Again, it's a book that goes through many years and goes through different seasons, but there are just some very memorable summer scenes in this one, again, sort of late spring and summer scenes, and I highly recommend picking this one up. And then a very famous book set in a day in June is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And I want to especially recommend this beautiful annotated edition. I absolutely love this edition. It's filled with wonderful pictures and photographs and lots of notes on the text of Mrs. Dalloway, as well as on Virginia Woolf's life and her writing influences. And I especially wanted to show you this fabulous map that's inside the book. And I know it's a bit hard to see because it's a small map, but essentially it depicts all of the walks of the different characters who are walking through London in this day in June. So if you want, you can actually follow along the walks, not just of Clarissa Dalloway, but of all the other characters as well who are walking through London. And I just love that feature in this book. And if you're in London, I think it would be so fun to go on some of these walks. If you want to read Mrs. Dalloway in June or reread it, then this would be great inspiration and a way of just going a little bit deeper into the novel to take these walks yourself. But this, of course, is such a classic book all about society in post-World War I Britain, and definitely June is the perfect month to pick it up, and I just think that this edition is really stunning, so I wanted to especially mention this one. And then Passing by Nella Larsen is a brilliant book to start in August. The book begins during an August heatwave in Chicago, and then it sort of builds up to New Year's Eve. So there are some cold, wintry scenes in the book too, but the beginning during this summer heatwave is so memorable, and the way that the tension rises to this incredible climax at the end of the novel just somehow resonates that heat wave and that rise in temperature. There's definitely a rise in temperature between the characters in this book, and that makes it a great heat wave read, I think. So on a especially hot day in the summer, it would be great to pick this one up. It's about two women. It's set in, well, it was written in the sort of 1920s, I believe, and it's about two Black women in America who have known each other from childhood, but then over the years have drifted apart, and then by chance they meet in a restaurant in Chicago on this very hot day in August. And after that initial chance reunion, their lives start to mingle more and more, but tension really rises between them because one of these women has chosen to live her life passing as a white woman and has created a whole life, a whole marriage around that. And her former friend from childhood, Irene, cannot understand this. So a lot of tension comes between the women, and it's amazing how much is packed into a very slight novella. But I so recommend picking this one up, and great one to read in August. And then another sort of classic summer favourite of mine is Frenchmans Creek by Daphne du Maurier. This is one of her historical fiction books, and it's just a really fun book to read, maybe if you're off on a seaside holiday, down in Cornwall or anywhere else, and you just fancy a bit of fun, then this book definitely ticks that box. I love the female character in this, Donna. She's such a woman ahead of her time, and she's very bored by her London socialite life. So she decides to go down to her husband's estate in Cornwall, and there she becomes entangled with a French pirate. And it's sort of just as romantic and exciting as you can imagine that would be. And it's just a really fun summer read. So one, again, that I recommend picking up, maybe especially if you're by the seaside. Then a real modern classic is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is one of my favourite books, and again it takes place in August. So it's a great summer read, and it's about an ageing butler who's been given a bit of a holiday by his new American employee, and he decides to spend that holiday driving through the British countryside. He has a definite destination and person in mind, but as he takes this slow drive, he reflects on his life and recollects incidents from the past, from the years especially in his prime, and how he became a butler at Darlington Hall, a huge estate in Britain. And he recalls memories from that time, his former employers, the people he knew, and it's just such an incredible book. If you've never read it, I really, really recommend it. It's one of my favourites, and summertime is a brilliant time to read it. Then a Yorkshire favourite of mine is A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. This is set during August. It's a lovely book to pick up, a very soothing read and very, very slight, so an easy one to pack in your suitcase if you're off on holiday anywhere. And this is about a man who is in many ways damaged after his experience in World War I, and he's seeking refuge in a small village in Yorkshire, and there he's working in the village church, uncovering an old medieval mural in the church. And as he works and starts to mingle a bit with the people who live in the village, he finds the atmosphere around him, especially the beautiful countryside, really rejuvenates him, and in some ways restores him to better health and to more of a balanced mental outlook. It's such a beautifully written novella, this one, and a perfect summer read. And then another book that sort of evokes nostalgia a bit in the way The Remains of the Day does to a certain extent is The Gobetween by L.P. Hartley. And this starts with an older man looking back on his youth, on his boyhood, and particularly one very hot summer when he went to stay with a school friend of his. He went to stay at this school friend's country estate, and what happened to him as a young boy, starting to enter into the world of adults, and what happened to him in this summer in particular. It's a coming of age story, such a memorable book. I absolutely love it. It's a brilliant summer read. It's a real sort of heat wave read. There's just soaring summer temperatures through all of this that of course delights young boys, especially to begin with, but as the heat rises, tensions in this country estate household really build, and the young protagonist of this book finds himself caught up in an intricate love triangle and a situation in the adult world that he doesn't really understand. And when it all comes to light, he has a huge shock, and a shock that in some ways spreads a shadow all through the rest of his life. A brilliant summer book. I so recommend reading this one if you haven't already. And then moving on to some general summer reads, I want to recommend Atonement by Ian McEwan. This isn't in some ways a favourite book of mine at all, but I do find it really fascinating to read this in conjunction with The Go-Between. McEwan has himself spoken about what a big influence The Go-Between was in writing Atonement, especially the first half of the book, which is set again in a very, very hot summer over a very short space of time, I think just 1 or 2 days, and this heat wave is occurring in the UK. And there are some definite similarities that you can really see between The Go-Between and Atonement. So I find it very interesting to read these books together and to pick up on some of those similar themes. I especially prefer the first half of Atonement as well, by the end it really does lose me a bit, I have to say. I don't like the ending and I don't really enjoy the second half of this book. But the first half is classic summer reading. The depiction of having this hot country house dinner party where they're served, I think, roast lamb or some sort of hot food, and it's an absolute heat wave, and how uncomfortable that is really well done. But like I said, I really would recommend reading The Go-Between and then reading Atonement and seeing if you can pick out some of those similarities and some of those similar themes that worked in these books, because I find that quite a fascinating exercise. And then if you fancy just some sort of family saga type reading in the summer, then of course I have to recommend The Light Years by Elizabeth Jane Howard. I know this looks quite a fat book, but it's the type of book that you can just whip through, and really it's the perfect beach read or the perfect book to take on the plane. I find that you just get so lost in the world of the Cazalet family that you'll find yourself just reading page after page after page, or at least that's what I do when I pick up one of the Cazalet Chronicles books. I really lose myself in the world, and I find that the books are real page turners in that sense, and that you just get so caught up with the story and the lives of all of the people that Elizabeth Jane Howard writes about. The Light Years is the first in the Cazalet Chronicles, and it's mainly really set over two summers, the summers of 1937 and 1938. And it ends just when World War II is about to begin. So there's this nostalgic feel a bit to the book about the summers just before the war started. And every year the Cazalet family gather at country house in the English countryside and spend fabulous summers together. A lot of the stories really told between the perspective of many, many different characters. So you get to hear from the younger characters as well as the older. And I find that works really well. I think that's such a hard thing to do in a book, to share the perspectives of really a lot of different characters, but somehow Elizabeth Jane Howard really pulls it off. So you get the perspective sometimes of the servants as well, or of the governess of the children, for instance. And it's just really, really well done. And there are different marriages, of course. You see all the different family members and what's happening in their love lives or in their marriages, what's falling apart, what's going well. And you also see the children starting to grow up in this book too. Anyway, definitely one of my favourite summer reads. I so recommend it. And then Rosamund Pilcher, like I said, one of my favourite sort of comfort writers, and The Shell Seekers. It's one of my favourite books. I first read it before I first went to Cornwall, and I always think of the seaside and Cornwall in the summertime, and that always makes me want to read Rosamund Pilcher's books because so many are set, at least partly, in Cornwall. This one is set in Cornwall, London, I think the Cotswolds a little bit, and Ibiza. So she gets around in this book, and it's not all a summery read, but I love the scenes in Cornwall so much in this story that that's what really makes me want to pick it up in the summertime. I know so many people love this Rosamund Pilcher book. If you've never read it, then do give it a try. Again, it's a great family saga type story like the Cazalet Chronicles. And it's one that also deals a bit with World War II and then the after effects of war and the older generation versus the younger generation. At the heart is the character Penelope, who is a mother to 3 children, and her father was a painter and they lived in Cornwall. he was never very famous while he was alive, but after his death, he's grown increasingly famous, and his paintings are worth more and more money. Of course, Penelope has some of her father's artwork, and some of her children start to really pressure her to sell these pieces to raise money. Penelope has to decide what she thinks is best to do, and all of this brings up memories for her of her past in Cornwall. Anyway, such a fabulous book, always a favourite of mine. Then China Court is set in August. This was a Comfort Book Club pick last August. And again, it's set in Cornwall. It's set over a few days in August, so this makes it a really good summer read. And again, it's a family saga. It covers generations of a family that grew up in the home of China Court in Cornwall. And the start of the book begins with the death of the sort of matriarch figure of the family. But it also starts with the arrival of a young woman, Tracy, who's been brought up in the States, but she's always remembered how much she loved her family home, China Court in Cornwall. And she goes to visit her grandmother just as her grandmother is dying. And China Court needs to be saved. There's a risk that it will be sold by all the other members of the family, but Tracy wants the house to remain in the family. So she really fights for it. And as she does, this stirs up the ghosts of former generations of the house, and you hear all of their stories too. And China Court gradually reveals its secrets and the secrets of those who used to live in it. Great family saga and a great summer read. Another book that is set mainly in August, and I think it just goes into September, but it's pretty much all in August, is Father by Elizabeth von Arnim. I recently read this and absolutely adored it. It's about a young woman, Jennifer, who made a promise to her mother on her mother's deathbed to care for her father, who is a famous writer, although hardly anyone reads any of his books. But his books are somehow still well known and well received amongst critics, but the general population will never read his books. Jennifer has lived quite a sorry existence, really, as the unpaid secretary to her father. But then one day, her father brings home a complete surprise, an extremely young second wife. And Jennifer is in fact over the moon at this news, because it means that she can finally escape her father and go off and live her own life. She is one of what they called the surplus women left in the wake of World War I. And she's never married and never really felt she had much of a chance at marriage. And what she decides to do is to go off to the countryside. She has a very small private income, and she thinks she can use this to rent a tiny cottage somewhere and just enjoy living her own life and pleasing herself. So this is what she does. She finds Rose Cottage, which is just as charming as it sounds. At least it's very romantic. Thatched cottage covered with roses and its own little garden and orchard. It doesn't really have very many amenities, but Jennifer doesn't let that bother her, and she starts to rent this cottage. Elizabeth von Arnim is an amazing nature writer. I just love her descriptions of the British countryside in this book, and I seem to be reading quite a bit on the theme of women finding freedom and a real sense of self in the countryside and in nature, and this book really fits in with that theme. Jennifer just falls in love with country living, and she so values her independence. She really gets into gardening. But But then a love interest does enter her life. Her neighbours are the curate and his sister, and the curate falls in love with Jennifer instantly. I don't want to say any more, I won't spoil it for you, but this is such a fun, light, very funny read with some sort of deeper, darker undertones to it, but overall this is just a real joy and very entertaining reading, so it'd be a great summer read. Then one book that's set, I think, in a day in July is One Fine Day by Molly Panter Downs. A lot of the books that I've been talking about look at life just before the outbreak of World War II. This looks at the life of a middle-class woman living in the British countryside just after war has ended. So this is in a July day in 1946, and in this book Molly Panter Downs really examines the life of post-war Britain through the sort of microcosm of a little village in a corner of the English countryside, and really through the lens of one woman in particular. It's not an especially political book or anything like that, but it still manages to say a lot about what life was like after the war. And there's quite a hopeful note to the book too, as the characters really look towards the future at the end. And I found this a really fascinating read. I'd like to reread it again soon, actually. It's such a slight book, and there are some very funny moments in this one too, and it's just quite a light, lovely read. Molly Panter Downs is such a great writer, but there's a sort of stronger meaning, more of a resonance to this book that really stays with you for quite some time after you've read it as well. And I would like to return to it again, but a perfect summer read. And then something just light and lovely is Summer at Fairacre by Miss Reed. Of course, I love Miss Reed books. I know many of you do as well. And this has to be the perfect time to maybe pick up Summer at Fairacre. I love the description they've given in the synopsis of this book. A little passage of it says, "And so a hot summer is very welcome, and this latest novel is truly a celebration of summer. It evokes the scent of hayfields and Albertine roses, the sound of skylarks and bees. Against this sunny background, village activities go on." Doesn't that just sound lovely? Definitely a book I want to curl up with in the garden with a glass of rosé this summer. That sounds perfect. Now, some darker books, because there is a bit of a gothic summer theme too. And one of my favourites, if you are in the mood for a bit of gothic this summer, is Bitter Orange by Claire Fuller. This is set in the late 60s, and it's about a middle-aged woman who is hiding a few secrets of her own, and she is unexpectedly employed by an American who has just bought a crumbling old country house in the British countryside. And she's been employed by him to go to this house, stay in it, and write up reports on the follies in the grounds of the house. So she moves into this house and then is surprised to find that she isn't alone. A young couple also turn up who have also been hired by the American. They actually all become friends, but this friendship soon takes on quite a dark turn. All of them are hiding some secrets. And this is just a really compelling page turner. It's definitely set over a hot summer, so it's a great summer read. There are wonderful descriptions of food in this book too, which I really enjoyed. And they all live together in more and more of a hedonistic lifestyle with all this great food that they buy, and they discover lots of wine in the cellar that they all start to drink. But of course it all reaches a boiling point at the end. But I won't spoil anything, but it is definitely quite a twisty page turner, so recommend that one. Then another darker book for the summertime is Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is an Australian classic. So this is actually set in a February, I think, of 1900 or thereabouts. But of course, because it's in Australia, it's a boiling hot day. So for us in the Northern Hemisphere, this makes a great summer read for now. It's actually about a picnic of a group of young Australian girls who are at a boarding school, quite an elite boarding school in Australia. And they go on an outing for St. Valentine's Day. They have a picnic together. But then something very strange happens on this picnic. Some of the girls and one of their teachers start to climb a monolith. And the further they climb, the more they get into a sort of dazed, almost trance-like state. One of the girls is terrified and sort of runs back, but she can't really remember anything that happened to her as she was walking. The other girls and the teacher all vanish and disappear. And it is how their disappearance, the repercussions of that disappearance, how that affects the school and the local community, is really what the book is about as well. And it has a very dark ending, but it's definitely a compelling read and one to pick up in the summertime for us for sure. And then another book that I think I read last summer and I really enjoyed it is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. And this was actually a really good summer read. It's set in a blazing hot Japanese summer, and it's about a very special cafe that attracts a lot of customers because it's always deliciously cool inside. So a lot of people wander in, trying to cool down during this hot summer. But there's something else that's very special about the cafe, and that is if you sit in a very particular chair at a certain table and order a coffee, you are able to travel backwards to a moment in time, as long as that moment occurred within the cafe itself. So this is a really charming collection of stories, all about different people, different problems they have, the different sadnesses, the different happinesses, the different reasons why they might want to travel back in time to connect with someone from their past, or to somehow maybe try to do over a moment in their lives from the past. And this is just a lovely, quite light summer read, but there are some quite poignant, some quite sad moments in this, but it's a really memorable book. And there's a sequel to it as well, which I still need to read, but I really recommend picking up the first volume. And then some children's and YA books I thought I would share. So I've already mentioned China Court, which is an adult book by Rumer Godden, but her YA novel, The Greengage Summer, is one of my favourites. This was partly based on something real that happened to Rumer Godden and her sister, which is quite extraordinary in some ways, but it's a brilliant summer book. It's about three sisters and their mother who go for a holiday in France, but almost as soon as they get there, their mother falls very ill and has to go into hospital. So the three sisters pretty much just fend for themselves, and the eldest two especially really stick together a lot. The story is told mainly from the perspective of the middle child, and she watches as her elder sister becomes more and more drawn to an Englishman who is staying at their hotel, but who is carrying on an affair with the female owner of the hotel. So quite a messy love triangle situation, and this is a real coming of age story where the main protagonist has to grow up and starts to really witness some of the complexities of adult life, especially as her sister gets more and more drawn into this world. They find the Englishman at the hotel ultimately very charming, but then they discover a shocking truth about him. Oh, I so recommend reading this if you never have. It's a brilliant book to pick up. And then a few more YA ones. I've spoken before about how much I enjoy Laura Wood's writing. She writes books mainly set in the 1920s, 1930s, about young women, normally aged from about 16 to 18. A Sky Painted Gold is set in Cornwall. It's about a young girl who wants to become a writer, and she gets drawn into the lives of some bright young things who own a big country house in Cornwall, and they start to throw very lavish, Gatsby-ish type parties that she ends up being invited to, and she gets more pulled into their world. You can see that Laura Wood likes writers like Georgette Hare and Dodie Smith, and I think has been influenced by some of those people, and she puts some of that in her books, which I really enjoy. So A Sky Painted Gold is a comfort book club choice for June, actually, and it's set in a summer in Cornwall, so that's great. And then this one, Under a Dancing Star by Laura Wood, is a great summer read as well, set in Italy. And this is about a young girl who wants to become a biologist, I think. Something scientific, but I think it was a biologist. And she goes out to Italy for a while, and there she meets a young man that she's sort of kind of drawn to, but also kind of not. It's loosely based on Much Ado About Nothing, the Shakespeare play, which I thought was quite fun. But I loved the Italian setting of this one too. Some children's books for the summer that I love. My Family and Other Animals. This starts on a pouring wet July day in the UK, which is sadly not uncommon. And Gerald Durrell and his family are utterly fed up with the weather, and they decide to move to Corfu. Thus begins the classic series. If you want a bit of escapism, then I so recommend reading this book and of all of their adventures in wonderful Corfu. And then two more children's books. The Adventurous Summer by Mabel Esther Allen is such a charming story. It's set in the Cotswolds when sister and her brother go and spend the summer with family in the Cotswolds, and there they befriend some other young children in the neighbourhood. It's just a really charming, sweet summer story. And then Henrietta's House by Elizabeth Goudge is another favourite children's book of mine. Again, it's a wonderful summer read. It's set in one day in the summertime. It's a friend of Henrietta's birthday. So everyone is gathered together to celebrate, and they're going off picnicking in the hills, but then they all have their own adventures at this picnic. And it ends in rather a lovely way in a beautiful house. So it's just a charming story, one I really love, and good picnic inspiration too, if you fancy a picnic in the summertime. And then finally, I wanted to share a few book recommendations to have on your bedside table in the summertime. So a good anthology that you can dip in and out of is always a great idea. And I love Melissa Harrison's nature anthologies. Summer, an anthology for the changing seasons, is a perfect book to have on your bedside table. It's full of poetry, extracts, short stories that all evoke summer in some way. So a lovely read. And then the Folio Summer anthology is also really beautiful. Quite a slim collection, this one. But again, there are some poems, there are some extracts from literature that all evoke glorious summer too. And I just think that this set of theirs is really beautiful. I have all of them, and the summer one is definitely going to be on my bedside table. And then, for those of you especially who like a bit of wild swimming, I recommend this collection of essays and stories about the Hampstead Heath ponds, especially the Ladies' Pond. So this was published by Daunt Books. It's called At the Pond, Swimming at the Hampstead Ladies' Pond. And a collection of writers all write about their experience of bathing, of wild swimming in the Ladies' Pond in Hampstead Heath. And these essays are put into the different seasons. So it actually starts with winter, then goes into spring, but then there's a whole summer section. So obviously I recommend reading the summer section, dipping into that over the next few months, and it would just be a nice companion and a nice book to have a read of before you go to sleep maybe at night. So I think that there's some really interesting essays in this one, so recommend that. And then if you fancy some short stories, then Midsommar Mysteries by Agatha Christie is a great choice. I like sometimes reading just a short story before I go to sleep, so having a short story collection on my bedside table is always a good idea, and some summery mysteries from Agatha Christie just sounds perfect. I'll be sharing some more of my favourite Agatha Christie's actually quite soon, but just for this I wanted to draw your attention to this lovely collection. And then more short stories. Oxford World's Classics just brought out this beautiful edition of some Virginia Woolf short stories, and it's called Kew Gardens and Other Short Fiction. Kew Gardens is set during a hot July day in Kew Gardens, so it's a great seasonal short story to read. The other sort of stories and short fiction in here aren't particularly summery, I don't think, so if you want something a little bit more seasonal than that, then I do recommend this collection of garden stories by Everyman's Pocket Classics. This does contain Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf in it as well, and it also has lots of other lovely short stories as well as extracts from longer fiction all about gardens and gardening, which of course is a great theme for the summer as well as the spring. So lovely book to have on your bedside table. Some poetry anthologies. One I'm recommending is The Sun and Her Flowers by Rupi Kaur. There's a lot of floral imagery in these poems that somehow feels particularly suited to summer. So a great poetry anthology to have on your bedside table. Generally the poems are very short, you know, like most sort of Instagram poetry is. And that makes it quite nice to just read something very, very light, very, very brief really before going to sleep, but that will always be a bit thought-provoking. So that's an interesting anthology. And then A Poem for Every Summer Day is obviously a great anthology. If you like poetry and you like reading a poem a night, then this would be a nice one to have on your bedside table. I like to have some books with beautiful artwork on my bedside table too, if I just want to look at something but not read too much. I love the Tate Publishing collection of seasonal paintings, and this summer one will be on my bedside table in the summer months. So it's just a great collection of summery artwork with a bit of information about each piece. So I find these anthologies very inspiring, really interesting, and some of the themes they pick out are quite interesting too. So I enjoy these books. And then How to Be a Wildflower is another lovely book to flick through, especially, and appreciate the lovely artwork. There are lots of activity ideas that are really very summery, like find a field of dandelions, make 100 wishes, press your flowers here. And there are also some nice quotes, but really a lot of it is just the beautiful illustrations, the floral illustrations in this book. And it's got an especially summery feel to it. So I do recommend this as just as a delight to flick through, to maybe inspire you a little bit to get out into nature and to enjoy nature. So lovely bedside table book there. And then finally, the summer book by Susan Branch. You know I'm a big fan of Susan Branch's books, and this one will definitely be on my bedside table. There are lots of recipes. It's mainly a recipe book, this one, but there are also wonderful quotes about summer, a few little activity suggestions for summer, and some musings from Susan Branch herself. And of course, it's got her amazing illustrations all throughout. Susan Branch is so clever at really evoking the seasons, and her artwork just brings each season to life for me. I absolutely love it. I think she's very clever. So her books are fabulous for a bit of seasonal reading, and I know I'm going to enjoy looking at the recipes too and maybe getting inspired. I love this little how to go to a tea party. That's wear a suitable dress or skirt, never pants or shorts. Sip slowly, don't slurp. I'll have to remember that. But anyway, one that will be great for my bedside table. So lots and lots of books in this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if any of these titles appeal to you in particular, or if you have any books you think I'd enjoy that you've got lined up for your summer reading. I would love to hear about that. Thank you so much for watching. Extra big thanks to those of you who pressed the super thanks button on my last video. So appreciate that support as always. But thank you to everyone who watches my videos. Do give a thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and I'll see you again on Friday. Take care and happy reading, everyone. Goodbye.